the town of Harmony Creek, North Carolina, prided itself on two things: its award-winning Azalea Festival and its unwavering support for the troops at nearby Fort Valor. Main Street was a parade of American flags, and nearly every diner and storefront had a "We Support Our Soldiers" sticker in the window. It was a place of simple values and deep-rooted traditions, where a uniform earned you a free cup of coffee and a respectful nod. Yet when Captain Eva Rostova arrived, the town's welcome felt distant, muted by a quiet confusion she had grown all too familiar with. That Eva was not what Harmony Creek, or indeed the soldiers of Fort Valor, expected. She was in her mid-30s, with a posture so straight it seemed carved from stone, but her presence was unnervingly quiet. She moved with a silent economy of motion, her dark eyes taking in everything without lingering. She spoke only when necessary, her voice calm and measured, betraying no hint of emotion. But the most noticeable thing about her, the detail that sparked whispers from the barracks to the town's only grocery store, was the pair of simple, black leather gloves she always wore. She wore them in the summer heat, she wore them indoors during briefings, and she wore them at the welcome luncheon the base commander had insisted on holding. The whispers started almost immediately. They were quiet at first, eddies of curiosity. In the sea of military life, why the gloves? A young private might ask. Maybe she's a germaphobe, another would suggest. But soon, the speculation turned sharper, edged with the casual cruelty of a closed community. She's probably just hiding soft hands, one soldier sneered in the mess hall. Never seen a day of real work. Leading this chorus of doubt was Lieutenant Kyle Miller. Miller was everything Eva was not: loud, brash, and dripping with the easy confidence of a man whose path had always been smooth. He came from a family of decorated officers. His father was a West Point legend, and his older brother was a rising star in the Pentagon. Miller believed he was destined for the same greatness. He saw the military in black and white. There were warriors, and there were support staff. There were men who fought, and there were people who filled quotas. In his mind, Captain Rostova, with her quiet demeanor and her mysterious gloves, clearly belonged to the latter category. He made his opinion known from their very first meeting. Colonel Thompson, the base commander, had introduced them in his office. Thompson was a man in his late 50s, with a kind face weathered by years of command. He looked at Eva with a deep, unreadable respect. "Captain Rostova, this is Lieutenant Miller. He'll be your second in command for the new training cycle," Thompson said, his voice warm. Miller snapped a crisp salute, his eyes sweeping over Eva with a dismissive glance. "Ma'am," he said, the word technically respectful, but his tone anything but. "Welcome to Fort Valor. I trust you'll find the assignment comfortable." The implication was clear. He thought she was here for an easy ride, a desk job to pad out her career. Eva met his gaze, her own expression unreadable. She didn't offer a handshake, her gloved hands remaining still at her sides. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I look forward to working with you," she said, her voice perfectly level. The lack of reaction seemed to irritate Miller more than any retort could have. He saw her calmness not as strength, but as emptiness. The first few weeks did little to change his opinion. Eva was assigned to overhaul the base's pre-deployment training program for a company of soldiers. It was considered a backwater assignment, far from the glory of active command. Miller, who had been hoping for a more prestigious role, felt his placement under her was a personal insult. He watched her every move, looking for weakness. He saw her in the chow hall, eating alone, methodically cutting her food with her gloved hands. He saw her at the firing range, where her marksmanship was flawless. Yet she showed no satisfaction, simply holstering her weapon and making quiet notes on a clipboard. She was a ghost in a uniform, a puzzle he had no interest in solving. He had already decided on the answer. One afternoon, he found her reviewing training schedules in the company office. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. "Settling in, all right, Captain?" he asked, his voice laced with false concern. "Must be a nice change of pace after your last post." He had glanced at her file, or the parts of it that weren't redacted. It listed her previous assignment simply as Administrative Liaison, Department of Defense. It sounded like a secretary's title to him. Eva didn't look up from her papers. "The pace is adequate, Lieutenant." Good. Miller pressed on, unable to help himself, "because this is important work. We're preparing soldiers for real combat. It's not just paperwork and pushing pencils. You need to understand the mindset of a warrior." Finally she lifted her head, her dark eyes fixing on him. There was no anger in them, just a profound stillness that was more unsettling than rage. "I am well aware of what we are preparing them for. Lieutenant, are you?" he scoffed, dropping the pretense of politeness. "With all due respect, Captain, some of us have spent our entire careers training for the front lines. We haven't been sitting behind a desk in Washington. These men need a leader who understands what it's like to have mud on their boots." Before Eva could respond, a new voice cut in. "Is there a problem here, Lieutenant?" Both officers turned to see Sergeant Frank Rizzo standing in the hallway. Rizzo was a bear of a man, a master sergeant with 30 years of service etched into the lines on his face. He was the senior non-commissioned officer for the company, and his loyalty was to the soldiers, not to the squabbles of the officer corps. He was a keen judge of character, and while he hadn't figured out Captain Rostova yet, he had Miller pegged from day one. Miller straightened up, his smirk vanishing. "No problem, Sergeant. Just having a professional discussion with the captain about training philosophy." Rizzo's eyes flickered to Eva, then back to Miller. "Well, the captain's philosophy is the only one that matters right now. I suggest you get back to prepping the equipment rosters. The captain and I need to go over the live fire exercise plans." It was a clear dismissal. Miller's jaw tightened, a flash of anger in his eyes. He gave a curt nod. "Of course, Sergeant." He shot one last look at Eva, a look that promised this was far from over. Before turning and stalking down the hall, Rizzo stepped into the office, his expression softening slightly as he looked at Eva. "Don't pay him any mind, ma'am. He's got a bigger ego than the whole 82nd Airborne." Eva gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "His record is excellent, Sergeant. His test scores are excellent, ma'am," Rizzo corrected gently. "There's a difference. A big one." He paused, his gaze falling to her hands, which were resting on the desk. "If you don't mind me asking, ma'am, the gloves. Is that a regulation thing I missed?" Eva's posture, if possible, became even more rigid. For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed her face. It wasn't anger or shame, but something deeper, something ancient. "It's a personal matter, Sergeant." Rizzo, sensing he had touched a nerve, immediately backed off. "Understood, ma'am. My apologies." "It's fine," she said, her voice returning to its usual flat tone. "Now, about that live fire exercise, I have some changes I'd like to implement." As she began to detail her plans, her mind briefly drifted. The sterile scent of the office faded, replaced by the smell of damp stone and something metallic, like old blood. She felt a phantom chill, a cold that had nothing to do with the air conditioning, a cold that started in her fingers and spread up her arms. It was a memory, a ghost that lived just beneath her skin. She blinked, forcing it down, shoving it back into the locked box in her mind where she kept the nightmares. She was Captain Rostova now. She was at Fort Valor. She was safe. But as she looked at the training plans, at the names of the young soldiers she was responsible for, she knew that safety was an illusion. The real war was the one you carried inside you, and it was a war that never, ever ended. The friction between Captain Rostova and Lieutenant Miller solidified into a quiet, grinding war over the next few weeks. It was a war fought not with weapons, but with conflicting ideologies about what it meant to be a soldier. Miller was a disciple of the old school, a believer in spit-and-polished discipline, perfectly executed drills, and the unshakable authority of the training manual. To him, victory was forged in precision and repetition. Eva, on the other hand, was a pragmatist. She had seen the bloody, chaotic reality that lay beyond the pristine pages of the regulations. She knew that real battlefields were messy, unpredictable, and cared nothing for perfectly creased uniforms. Her training methods were unorthodox, designed to shock the soldiers out of their complacency and force them to think, adapt, and survive. She canceled the traditional Saturday morning drill and inspection. Instead, she had the entire company woken at 3 in the morning by simulated mortar, fire, and tear gas. As the disoriented soldiers stumbled out of their barracks, choking and confused, she had them run a 5-mile course in full gear, carrying a wounded comrade on a stretcher. Miller was furious. "This is chaos, not training." He yelled at her as they stood in the pre-dawn chill, watching the exhausted soldiers struggle. "You're breaking their morale. Where's the discipline? Where's the structure?" "The enemy doesn't care about structure," Lieutenant Eva replied calmly, her eyes scanning the soldiers, noting who was helping their teammates and who was complaining. "They care about creating chaos. If our soldiers can't handle a little chaos here, they'll break over there." She introduced other changes that grated on Miller's nerves. She had them practice field dressing wounds in near-total darkness, using only the sense of touch. She taught them how to find water and edible plants, survival skills Miller dismissed as Boy Scout games. She spent hours teaching them to resist psychological manipulation, running mock interrogations that were disturbingly realistic, though she never laid a hand on them. She would simply talk to them, her voice low and steady, finding their insecurities, and pressing on them until they learned to build mental walls. The soldiers were divided. Some, like Miller, grumbled about the new regimen. They missed the predictability of the old ways. But many others, especially the younger ones who hadn't yet been hardened by military dogma, began to respond. They found a new confidence in their abilities. They were still exhausted, but it was the satisfying exhaustion of having overcome a real challenge, not the mindless fatigue of endless drills. Sergeant Rizzo was the first to become a true convert. He was an old dog, but he was smart enough to recognize a valuable new trick. He saw the change in the soldiers. They were becoming more resilient, more aware of their They were learning to rely on each other in a way that marching and formation could never teach. One afternoon, Rizzo found Eva alone in the armory, meticulously cleaning her service pistol, her gloved hands moving with practiced efficiency. "They're getting better, ma'am," he said, leaning against a weapon rack. "The men, they're complaining, but they're getting better." That chaos drill had woke a few of them up. Eva looked up, a rare hint of something other than blank professionalism in her eyes. It might have been satisfaction. Good complacency is a luxury they can't afford. Miller doesn't see it, Rizzo said, shaking his head. He's still convinced you're trying to turn his platoon into a bunch of undisciplined cowboys. Lieutenant Miller is an excellent marksman and a fine drill leader, Eva stated, her tone neutral. He will perform his duties, but he doesn't trust you, Rizzo said bluntly. And the men can feel that. It's not good for cohesion. Eva finished reassembling her pistol with a final, decisive click. She holstered it and turned to face him fully. Trust is not given, Sergeant. It is earned. Lieutenant Miller is no different from any other soldier. He will trust what he sees to be effective. If my methods work, he will see it. If they do, not, he will be right. Her logic was unassailable, but Rizzo knew it wasn't that simple. Miller wasn't just skeptical. He was actively looking for ways to undermine her. He had begun documenting every deviation Eva made from the standard training protocol, compiling a list he no doubt intended to present to Colonel Thompson. He was building a case against her, brick by brick. The conflict wasn't confined to the base. In Harmony Creek, Eva remained an enigma. She would occasionally visit the town's diner for a quiet meal, always sitting in a booth in the back, her gloved hands resting on the table. The locals, accustomed to the boisterous, backslapping camaraderie of soldiers like Miller, didn't know what to make of her. They treated her with a polite but cautious distance. One Friday evening, Eva was in that very diner when Miller and a group of his friends, fellow junior officers, walked in. They were loud and cheerful, fresh from a week of what Miller considered real work. They took a large table in the center of the room, and Miller, holding court, began telling an exaggerated story about a recent field exercise. Double quotes. So, there we are, pinned down, rain coming in sideways, he boomed, his voice carrying across the diner. I had to low crawl through 100 yards of mud, under live fire, just to get to the objective. It was brutal, the kind of thing that separates the men from the boys. Eva continued to eat her meal, not giving any indication that she was listening, but she heard every word. She heard the laughter of the other officers, the admiring sighs of the waitresses. She saw the owner of the diner send over a round of drinks on the house for Fort Valor's finest. Then, one of Miller's friends lowered his voice, but not enough. Hey, isn't that your new CO? He asked, nodding towards Ava's booth. Miller glanced over, his lip curling in a faint sneer. That's her? Captain Quiet, probably writing a report on the salt shaker alignment. The table chuckled. What's the deal with the gloves? Anyway, another officer asked, is she hiding something? She's hiding from a paper cut. Probably, Miller said, loud enough for Eva to hear clearly this time. Don't worry, boys. Some people are made for the field, and some are made for the office. We all have our part to play. The insult hung in the air, thick and greasy as the smell of the fryer. Eva slowly placed her fork and knife on her plate. For a long moment, she didn't move. The diner fell quiet. The other patrons, sensing the sudden tension, SGT Rizzo, who had been sitting at the counter, turned on his stool, his face like a thundercloud. He looked ready to cross the room and lift Miller out of his chair by his throat, but Eva simply picked up her check, left a $20 bill on the table, and stood up. As she walked towards the door, she had to pass Miller's table. He looked up at her, a smug, challenging glint in his eye, daring her to react. She met his gaze, and for a fleeting second, the mask of calm slipped. He saw something in her eyes that made the hairs on his arms stand up. It was a look of such profound, ancient weariness, mixed with a cold, hard resolve that it made his own bravado feel like a child's game. It was the look of someone who had seen the end of the world and had walked back. Then it was gone. Her face was a blank slate again. She gave a slight, formal nod. Lieutenant, she said, her voice devoid of any inflection. And then she was gone. The little bell over the diner door jingling softly in her wake. Miller's friends started to laugh and clap him on the back. But Miller didn't join in. He just stared at the door, the cold look in her eyes seared into his memory. He had wanted to provoke her, to get a reaction, to prove she was weak. But he had a sinking feeling that he had just poked a sleeping bear, and he had no idea how massive that bear truly was. Lieutenant Miller's campaign against Captain Rostova found its perfect weapon in the form of a looming date on the base calendar, the battalion readiness inspection. This was not a drill or a simulation. It was a top-to-bottom evaluation conducted by inspectors from division headquarters. Every piece of equipment had to be accounted for, every uniform perfectly pressed, every soldier able to recite regulations on command. It was a test of discipline, order, and adherence to the book. It was Miller's world. He saw it as his golden opportunity. Ava's unorthodox methods, her focus on messy, realistic scenarios over pristine drill ground perfection, would surely be her downfall. He imagined the inspectors finding fault with her unconventional training logs, her unit's slightly scuffed equipment, the soldiers who might be able to survive in the wild but couldn't name the third general order. He would be there, of course, looking crisp and professional, ready to explain how he had tried to maintain standards under a commander with a different philosophy. He would be the voice of reason, the loyal subordinate who had done his best in a difficult situation. In the weeks leading up to the inspection, Miller became a whirlwind of zealous activity. He was a tyrant of the trivial, a stickler for the smallest details. He would spend an hour berating a private for a single loose thread on a cuff. He wrote up reports on dusty rifle racks and improperly folded T-shirts. He was, in his own mind, saving the company from the brink of chaos. He was defending the very soul of the army. Eva watched his frantic efforts with her usual unnerving calm. She did not interfere. When he requested extra time for drill and ceremony practice, she approved it. When he insisted on personally inspecting every locker, she signed the order. She let him have his way, a decision that Miller mistook for weakness, for an admission that she was out of her depth. Sergeant Rizzo saw it differently. "Ma'am, you've got to rein him in," he said to her one evening. As they watched Miller drill a platoon under the harsh glare of the parade ground lights, screaming himself hoarse over the angle of a salute, "He's running the men ragged, over things that don't matter. They're exhausted. It's hurting their performance in the real training. The inspection is important to the lieutenant," Sergeant Eva said, her eyes on the tired soldiers. "And it is a part of our duties. Let him perform his bet." "He's doing it to make you look bad," Rizzo insisted. "He's building a paper trail of your failures to show the colonel." "The colonel is not a fool," Eva said simply, "and the inspection will be what it will be. Our job is to be ready." In all aspects, the day of the inspection arrived. A crisp, clear autumn morning. The air was thick with the nervous energy of hundreds of soldiers. The inspectors, a team of stern-faced majors and command sergeants major, arrived looking grim and ready to find fault. Miller was in his element, his uniform so heavily starched it could have stood up on its own. He escorted the lead inspector, a humorless major named Davies, with an air of supreme confidence. The morning was a blur of evaluations, equipment layouts, maintenance records, barracks cleanliness. To Miller's growing frustration, Ava's company passed every test. The equipment, while not gleaming, was perfectly maintained. The records, though unconventional, were meticulous. The soldiers, while tired, were disciplined and respectful. Ava's quiet, persistent focus on practical readiness had paid off in ways Miller hadn't anticipated. The final phase of the inspection was the formal review, the entire company in their Class A dress uniforms, standing in perfect formation in the base gymnasium. This was the pinnacle of military ceremony, the ultimate test of appearance and discipline. This was Miller's last, best chance to see Eva fail. Colonel Thompson stood with the inspection team as they moved down the long lines of soldiers. Major Davies and Lieutenant Miller walked together, their eyes sharp, missing nothing. A scuffed boot here, a crooked ribbon there, every minor infraction was noted on a clipboard. Finally, they reached the front of the formation where the company officers stood. They passed Sergeant Rizzo, who was immaculate. Then they came to Captain Rostova. She stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed forward. Her uniform was flawless, her ribbons perfectly aligned, her posture a testament to military bearing. Miller felt a surge of frustration. She was untouchable. Then he saw them. The gloves, the simple, plain black leather gloves. In the sterile, formal environment of the gymnasium, under the bright lights, they stood out as a flagrant violation of protocol. Dressed uniforms had their own prescribed white gloves for officers, to be worn only on specific ceremonial occasions. These black, everyday gloves were completely out of place. A slow, triumphant smile spread across Miller's face. He had her on a clear, undeniable, public breach of regulations. Right in front of the lead inspector and the base commander. He stopped directly in front of her. "Captain Rostova," he began, his voice ringing with authority. Major Davies paused. Raising an eyebrow, Colonel Thompson took a half-step forward, a flicker of concern on his face. "Your uniform is out of regulation, Captain," Miller announced, his voice loud enough for the entire front rank to hear. Eva did not flinch. "In what way, Lieutenant?" "Your gloves," Miller said, pointing a dramatic finger. "They are not authorized for wear with the Class A uniform during a formal inspection. You are to remove them immediately." The gymnasium, which had been filled with a low hum of nervous energy, fell completely silent. Every eye was on them. The soldiers stood like statues, but their attention was laser-focused on the drama unfolding before them. Ava's gaze remained fixed on the far wall. "My gloves are worn for medical reasons, Lieutenant," she said, her voice low but clear. Miller let out a short, sharp laugh of disbelief. It was an ugly, mocking sound in the cavernous room. "Medical reasons. Captain, we are soldiers. We don't get to pick and choose regulations based on our personal comfort. I have never heard of a medical exemption for gloves during a uniform inspection." He turned to Major Davies, seeking validation. "Sir, this is a clear breach of discipline. It sets a terrible example for the troops." Major Davies looked uncomfortable, glancing from Miller to the impassive Eva, and then to Colonel Thompson, whose face had become a thunderous mask. "What's the matter, Captain?" Miller pressed on, his arrogance swelling as he sensed victory. He lowered his voice into a conspiratorial, insulting whisper. "Afraid to get your hands dirty? Or just don't want to break a nail?" It was the same insult he had used in the diner, but this time it was public, official. a direct challenge to her authority and her honor in front of her command and her soldiers. Colonel Thompson started to speak. "Lieutenant, that's enough." But Eva cut him off, not with words, but with a slight turn of her head. She looked at the colonel, and in her eyes was a silent, powerful message. "Let this happen. It's time." Thompson fell silent, his jaw tight. Miller, emboldened by the colonel's silence, took it as a green light. He stood taller, his voice hardening into a formal command. "Captain Rostova, for the final time, I am giving you a direct order. Take off the gloves." The air in the gymnasium was so thick with tension it felt hard to breathe. This was more than an inspection now. It was a trial, a public execution of a career. And Lieutenant Miller was holding the axe, a wide, smug grin on his face. He had one. A profound, suffocating silence gripped the gymnasium. The rhythmic breathing of 200 soldiers seemed to cease. Every person in the room was frozen, their eyes locked on the two officers at the head of the formation. Lieutenant Miller stood with his chest puffed out, the very picture of arrogant triumph. Captain Eva Rostova stood like a statue of ice, her face an unreadable mask. Colonel Thompson watched, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His instincts screamed at him to intervene, to shut Miller down and end this public humiliation. But the look Eva had given him, a look of grim acceptance, of a decision made, held him in place. He felt like a spectator at a tragedy he was powerless to stop. Eva's movements were slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. She did not look at Miller. She did not look at the shocked faces of her soldiers. She looked straight ahead, at the large American flag hanging on the far wall, as if drawing strength from it. First she lifted her left hand. With her right, she grasped the tip of the middle finger of the glove and pulled. The leather made a soft sighing sound as it slid off her skin. She held the empty glove in her right hand. Then, she raised her right hand. Using her now bare left hand, she repeated the process, pulling the second glove free. She held both gloves, neatly folded together in her left hand, and then she lowered her hands to her sides, palms facing forward, in the position of attention. Her hands were exposed for everyone to see. A collective gasp rippled through the room. It was a soft, horrified sound, like the wind being knocked out of 200 men at once. Miller's smug grin vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of utter, sickening disbelief. His face went pale, the color draining from it as if a plug had been pulled. He froze, his body rigid, his eyes wide with a horror he could not process. The hands of Captain Eva Rostova were not the hands of a desk jockey. They were not the hands of someone who is afraid to break a nail. They were a road map of agony. Her fingers were a landscape of ruin. The tips were a mass of gnarled, discolored scar tissue, waxy and pale in some places, a deep, angry purple in others. Her fingernails were mostly gone. On the few fingers where they remained, they were twisted, deformed things, growing and thick and yellowed, like claws. The skin was puckered and drawn tight, crisscrossed with a network of fine, silvery scars that climbed from the fingertips down to the knuckles. They were the hands of someone who had been systematically, brutally, and patiently destroyed, and had survived. Sergeant Rizzo, standing in the front rank, felt a hot, furious rage well up in his chest, so powerful it almost choked him. His mind, trained by decades of experience, instantly understood. He had seen the aftermath of war in all its forms. He knew what he was looking at. This wasn't a burn. It wasn't an accident. This was torture. This was the work of an enemy interrogator. The quiet, mysterious captain, the woman they had all whispered about, had endured something beyond their darkest nightmares. Colonel Thompson's face was a grim, stony mask of regret and dawning comprehension. The heavily redacted portions of Ava's file, the parts that spoke of a long medical leave and a reassignment for recuperation, suddenly blazed with a terrible clarity in his mind. He finally understood the depth of the respect the Pentagon had for this woman, and the depth of the disservice he had just allowed to happen in his gymnasium. Eva said nothing. She didn't have to. Her silence was the most powerful indictment in the room. She simply stood there, in perfect military posture, her ruined hands displayed for all to see. Her gaze, still fixed on the flag, was steady and unbroken. There was no shame in her eyes, no pity. There was only a profound, unshakable dignity that made Miller's earlier taunts seem like the pathetic squeaking of a mouse. Miller tried to speak. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. A strangled, gurgling noise caught in his throat. The clipboard he was holding slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered to the polished floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the dead silence. The humiliation he had so carefully engineered for Eva had turned on him, consuming him. In a tidal wave of shame, he was the one on trial now, and he had been found guilty by the entire battalion. Slowly, Colonel Thompson walked forward until he was standing beside Miller. He didn't look at the disgraced lieutenant. He looked at Eva, his eyes filled with a respect so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Captain Rostova," he said, his voice low and thick with emotion. "Thank you." It was all he could manage. Then he turned, and his gaze fell upon Miller. The warmth and kindness were gone from the colonel's face, replaced by a glacial fury that made Miller physically flinch. "Lieutenant Miller, Thompson said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. My office. Now? He then turned back to the company. Sergeant Major, he called out to the lead inspector's NCO. The inspection for this company is concluded. They have passed. With distinction. He looked one last time at Eva, his voice softening again. Captain, you are dismissed. Please, see the base surgeon at your convenience. It was a clumsy, inadequate apology, an offer of an escape from the hundreds of pairs of eyes that were now staring at her, not with suspicion, but with a mixture of horror, pity, and a dawning, overwhelming awe. Eva gave a single, sharp nod. With the same slow, deliberate grace, she brought her hands together and began to pull the black gloves back on. First the right, then the left. She smoothed the leather over her fingers, hiding the terrible story they told, encasing the evidence of her sacrifice back in its quiet prison. Once the gloves were on, she executed a perfect about-face, her back ramrod straight. She strode out of the gymnasium, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She did not look back. She left behind a room full of stunned soldiers, a shamed and broken lieutenant, and the ghost of a pain so immense it had sanctified the very ground on which she stood. The story of what happened in the gymnasium did not just spread through Fort Valor, it detonated. It traveled from the barracks to the motor pool, from the officers' club to the mess hall, carried on hushed, reverent whispers. The narrative surrounding Captain Eva Rostova was rewritten in a single, dramatic moment. The quiet, aloof officer was gone. In her place stood a legend. The whispers of doubt were replaced by rumors of her heroism, each retelling adding another layer of myth. They said she had been captured behind enemy lines. They said she had been held for months. They said she had been tortured for information and had never broken, never given up the names of her team or the details of her mission. They said her hands were the price she had paid for their safety. Soldiers, who had once mocked her, now fell silent when she passed. They would avert their eyes, not out of suspicion, but out of a deep, humbling respect. Her black gloves were no longer a symbol of strangeness, but a badge of honor, more significant than any ribbon or medal she wore on her chest. Eva had not sought their validation, but she had received it in its most potent form, awe. While Eva's reputation was being forged in the fires of barracks gossip, Lieutenant Miller's was being reduced to ash. He sat in a hard-backed chair in front of Colonel Thompson's desk, a shrunken, pathetic figure. The colonel was silent for a long time, letting Miller stew in his own toxic shame. The only sound in the office was the quiet ticking of a wall clock, each tick a hammer blow to Miller's shattered pride. Finally, Thompson slid a thin file across the desk. It was marked with the highest level of classification. This is a declassified summary of Captain Rostova's service record. Lieutenant, I have been authorized to read it to you. I want you to understand the magnitude of your failure. The colonel opened the file and began to read in a low, dispassionate monotone. The words painted a picture of a world Miller could barely comprehend. Captain Eva Rostova had not been a liaison. She had been an operative in a highly specialized clandestine unit. Her mission had been in a war-torn region of Syria, a place where the rules of conventional warfare did not apply. She was there to make contact with a local asset who had vital intelligence on a planned terrorist attack. Captain Rostova's team was ambushed. Thompson read, his voice flat. She was separated from them during the firefight and captured by an enemy militia known for its brutality. She was declared missing, presumed captured. Thompson looked up, his eyes boring into Miller. She was held for 112 days. Lieutenant, for nearly 4 months, she was subjected to what her rescuers termed extreme and sustained methods of interrogation. The enemy wanted the location of her team's emergency extraction point and the identity of her asset. According to the after-action report, the primary method of persuasion involved the systematic crushing of the bones in her hands and the removal of her fingernails with heated pliers. Miller made a choking sound and his face, already pale, turned a sickly shade of green. Thompson continued, his voice relentless. 112 days. Miller, a rescue team finally located the compound and breached it. They found her in a subterranean cell. She was severely malnourished, suffering from multiple infections, but she was alive, and she had not talked. The extraction point was never compromised. Her team got out. The asset was protected. The intelligence was secured, and the attack she was working to prevent was thwarted. The report estimates that her silence saved the lives of over 300 civilians. The colonel closed the file with a soft, final thud. Her hands, Lieutenant. The scars you found so amusing are the reason hundreds of people are alive today. While you were at West Point learning how to salute, she was living through a hell you can't even imagine. And she did it with more honor and courage than you have ever shown in your entire pampered life. Miller finally broke. A dry, racking sob escaped his lips. He slumped forward in his chair, covering his face with his hands, his body shaking. Everything he thought he knew about strength, about honor, about being a soldier, had been a lie. He was a fraud, and he had publicly mocked a true hero. Meanwhile, Eva was fighting a war on a different front. The public unveiling of her scars had breached the walls she had so carefully constructed around her trauma. The memories she kept locked away were now rattling the door. The phantom chill in her hands was constant. At night, the nightmares returned with a vengeance, filled with the smell of damp stone, the searing heat, and the face of her interrogator. She sought refuge in the only place that made sense to her, the training area. Late one night, she was walking the perimeter of the obstacle course when Sergeant Rizzo found her. He didn't say anything at first, just fell into step beside her, the two of them walking in the comfortable silence of shared understanding. "The men are proud to serve under you, ma'am," Rizzo said finally, his voice soft. Eva kept walking, her eyes on the dark shapes of the obstacles. "They're good soldiers, Sergeant. You didn't have to let him do that," Rizzo said. "The inspection, you could have stopped him. The colonel would have backed you up." Eva stopped and turned to face him under the pale moonlight. "Yes," she said, "I could have. But then they would have always wondered. The whispers wouldn't have stopped. They would have seen me as the officer who needed special treatment, who hid behind a medical excuse." "Sometimes," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "it's better to face the fire. Get it over with." Rizzo saw the deep, profound exhaustion in her eyes, the terrible weight she carried. "You don't have to carry it all alone, ma'am," he said gently. "This company, these soldiers, they'd follow you into hell and back now. You just have to let them." A single tear traced a path down Ava's cheek, the first sign of emotion anyone had seen from her. She quickly wiped it away with the back of her gloved hand. "Thank you, Sergeant," she whispered. It was an acknowledgement, a small crack in the armor. The next morning, Lieutenant Miller was once again summoned to the colonel's office. He walked in looking like a man on his way to his own execution. "I have considered your actions," Lieutenant Colonel Thompson said, his voice cold and official. "Your behavior was unprofessional, dishonorable, and a disgrace to this uniform. I have two options for you. Option 1 is a formal, career-ending letter of reprimand. It will be placed in your permanent file. You will never be promoted. You will be shuffled from one dead-end assignment to another until you finally decide to resign in disgrace. Your family's legacy ends with you." Miller flinched as if he'd been struck. "Option 2, the colonel continued, is that you will stand before the entire battalion at morning formation. You will offer a full public apology to Captain Rist. You will admit your prejudice and your ignorance. After that, for the next 6 months, you will be functionally assigned to her. You will perform any duty she deems fit, without complaint. You will be her shadow, her aide, her project. The choice is yours." It was a choice between a swift death and a long, painful, public penance. Miller looked at the colonel, his eyes filled with shame and a flicker of something new, a desperate, drowning desire for a chance, any chance, to atone. The entire battalion was assembled on the main parade ground. The rising sun cast long shadows across the field, and a nervous silence hung in the cool morning air. Every soldier knew why they were there. Captain Rostova stood at the front of her company, her posture as straight and unyielding as ever. Colonel Thompson stood on the reviewing platform, his expression grim. Lieutenant Miller walked from the side of the field and mounted the steps to the platform. He looked pale and humbled. He approached the microphone, his hands trembling slightly. He took a deep breath and looked out at the sea of faces, his eyes finally landing on Eva. I have asked for this opportunity to speak to you all," he began, his voice cracking at first before finding a fragile strength. "Yesterday, during a formal inspection, I publicly and wrongfully challenged the authority and honor of Captain Eva Rist. I did so out of arrogance, ignorance, and a prejudice that I am only now beginning to understand." He took another breath, his gaze still locked on Eva. "I questioned her fitness for command. I mocked her. I accused her of weakness. I was wrong. I was profoundly, disgracefully wrong." His voice grew stronger, filled with a raw, painful honesty. "I believed that strength was about shouting orders and looking tough. I had no concept of true strength. I had no idea what real courage looked like. Now I do. It looks like Captain Rostova." He turned his body to face her directly, a gesture of complete submission. "Captain, I cannot begin to express the depth of my shame and my regret. My words were not just an insult to you, but an insult to every soldier who has ever sacrificed for this country. I am not fit to stand on the same field with you. My apology is inadequate, but it is all I have to offer. I am sorry." He stepped back from the microphone, his shoulders slumped. The silence that followed was different from the one in the gymnasium. It was not tense or horrified. It was contemplative, respectful. Eva gave a single, sharp nod of acknowledgement. It was not forgiveness, not yet. It was an acceptance of the gesture. For the next 6 months, Miller became Ava's shadow. He expected to be given the most demeaning, humiliating tasks. He was prepared to clean latrines, to inventory endless supplies, to be the target of every joke. But Eva did not humiliate him. Her method of penance was far more challenging. She assigned him to be the lead administrator for a new program she was designing. She called it Advanced Resilience and Resistance Training. It was a course based on her own experiences, designed to teach soldiers the psychological and emotional skills needed to survive captivity. Miller's job was to read the source materials, declassified reports on interrogation techniques, survivor testimonies, psychological studies on trauma. He had to organize the harrowing data, transcribe the stories of men who had endured the unthinkable, and prepare the lesson plans. Eva was forcing him to look into the abyss. Every day, he was immersed in the world of pain and suffering that she had inhabited for 112 days. He read about techniques that made his stomach turn, about the quiet, insidious ways the mind can be broken. He began to understand that the scars on her hands were only the visible wounds. He was learning her story not as a punishment, but as the most profound and difficult education of his life. Months later, the program culminated in a massive, week-long training exercise. It was the final test for the company before deployment. Eva had designed a scenario of unparalleled complexity. It was a simulated mission in a hostile, unstable country, where the soldiers were constantly harassed, given conflicting information, and put under immense psychological stress. On the final day, the scenario reached its climax. Miller's platoon was tasked with securing a high-value target from a village filled with hostile role-players. Everything that could go wrong did. Their communications were jammed. A simulated IED wounded several soldiers. The villagers, played by seasoned instructors, swarmed them, screaming, crying, and accusing them of atrocities. It was pure, terrifying chaos. The platoon began to panic. Young soldiers, overwhelmed by the sensory overload, started making mistakes. The platoon sergeant was shouting conflicting orders. Miller felt the familiar urge to take control, to start yelling, to impose order through force. But then he looked over and saw Eva. She was standing calmly amidst the chaos, her eyes scanning everything, her expression focused. She caught his eye and gave him a slight nod. It was a transfer of trust. Miller took a breath. He didn't shout. He remembered the lessons from the manuals he had studied, the principles Eva had taught him. He began to speak, his voice low and calm, cutting through the noise. He gave simple, clear instructions. He delegated tasks. He used the de-escalation techniques he had learned to calm the villagers. He organized the treatment of the wounded. He was not the arrogant lieutenant from before. He was a leader. In a key moment, Eva gave him a critical task over the radio, to create a diversion on the far side of the village to draw away the main hostile force. It was a task that required independent judgment and trust in his training. He executed it flawlessly. The exercise was a success, not because of brute force, but because of calm, resilient leadership. The story ends not on the battlefield, but several months later, back in Harmony Creek. It's the 4th of July, and the town is holding its annual community picnic in the park. The air is filled with the smell of barbecue and the sound of children's laughter. Captain Eva Rostova is there. She's no longer an outsider. She sits at a picnic table with Sergeant Rizzo and his family. Lieutenant Miller, now a more thoughtful and respected officer, is at a nearby table with his own platoon, and he gives her a respectful nod, which she returns. The townspeople no longer stare at her with suspicion. They greet her with warm, genuine smiles. A little girl, no older than 6, chasing a stray balloon, toddles up to Eva's table. She looks at Eva with wide, curious eyes and points to her hand. "Why do you wear gloves?" she asks, her voice innocent and clear. The old Eva would have frozen, or deflected. But this Eva is different. A small, gentle smile touches her lips. Slowly, she reaches down and pulls off her right glove. She doesn't hide her hand. She lays it flat on the table, where the sunlight catches the silvery network of scars. The little girl looks at the hand, her head cocked. She isn't horrified, she's just curious. "A long time ago, I got hurt," Eva says, her voice soft. "These," she says, lightly touching a fingertip, "are just a reminder. They remind me that you can get through anything, no matter how bad it hurts. They're a sign that I'm strong." The little girl considers this for a moment. Then she reaches out her own tiny, perfect hand and gently touches one of Eva's scarred fingers. "Wow," she whispers, her eyes full of wonder. "You're like a superhero?" Eva looks at the child, then out at the peaceful park, at the soldiers and families living under the flag she had sacrificed so much for. For the first time in a very long time, the phantom chill in her hand is gone, replaced by the warmth of the sun and the simple healing touch of an innocent child. She was home. She was at peace. Her war was finally over.